World of Warfare presents Operations Plunder and Varsity. In January of 1945, Adolf Hitler's last offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, had ended in a catastrophic defeat for Germany. A little more than 3 months later, and 9 months after the D-Day Normandy invasions, the Western Allies had broken out from Normandy and pushed across the Siegfried Line fortifications that defended Germany's frontier from invasion, before fighting their way to the last great natural barrier separating Allied forces from the German heartland, the Rhine River, a place where the Wehrmacht vowed to make their last stand in the West. To the east, Joseph Stalin's Red Army was just 50 miles from Berlin, giving most GIs a clear sense that Germany's defeat was an impending reality. Much like their fathers who fought in the trenches of World War I, Allied troops began to fear that they would fall in battle, with the end just a few short weeks away. Yet not all Germans were ready to accept defeat, since they were now fighting an enemy on German soil, defending their own homes and families and motherland against foreign invaders. The sense of resistance was strongest among German teenagers drafted into the army, since they had known no other reality than the Nazi state and Nazi propaganda over the course of their lives, as they latched onto slogans like "Germany must live even if we die," or "You are nothing, your people are everything." Even Hitler himself believed a defiant standoff at the Rhine River could hand the Allies a crushing 11th-hour defeat, despite his now badly weakened Wehrmacht forces and his own delusional thinking that he could still win the war. As for General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allied Supreme Commander, he knew full well that the Germans would mount fierce resistance along the Rhine, given its formidable natural choke point and its symbolic gateway into the German heartland. By March of 1945, 3 Allied army groups had reached the banks of the Rhine, vying with each other to be the first to cross to the eastern shore. To the north was British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group, consisting of the 1st Canadian Army, the British 2nd Army, and the U.S. 9th Army. In the center was U.S. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, made up of the U.S. 1st and 3rd Armies, while to the south was U.S. General Jacob L. Devers' 6th Army Group, made up of the U.S. 7th Army and the French 1st Army. While the retreating German army had destroyed most bridges over the Rhine, on March the 7th, scouts of the U.S. 9th Armored Division crested a hill overlooking Remagen, where they were stunned to see retreating German soldiers and civilians crossing the still intact 1,148-foot Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine. Called in by his scouts, General William Hogue, an experienced engineer officer and veteran of D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, took charge of the task of seizing the town of Remagen before controlling the Ludendorff Bridge. Unbeknownst to the Allies, the Germans had already tried to blow the bridge once, which failed to detonate, returning under the cover of darkness to rig the bridge with insufficient explosives directly under the nose of the Allies. And while their explosives went off on the Germans' second try, the bridge remained weakened yet standing. Tasked with taking the bridge, a Pershing tank helped clear a path for the infantry, which came under fire from machine gun nests positioned in towers on either side of the bridge, which were soon taken out by more Pershing tanks called in for the task. American GIs who crossed the bridge in the first wave recalled a mix of fear that the Germans might try to blow the bridge with them on it. Yet despite sporadic sniper fire, those first men on the bridge crossed without a single casualty, disabling charges as they moved across the deck. Within 24 hours after the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge, some 8,000 troops had crossed the Rhine into the German heartland. Hitler was furious over the loss of the bridge, calling for its immediate destruction, as well as the execution of Major Hans Scheller, the man he blamed for letting the bridge fall into the hands of the enemy. replaced by seasoned Luftwaffe General Albert Kesselring, who was tasked with repelling the Allies from crossing the Rhine. Kesselring oversaw 3 divisions of largely older men or fresh recruits from the Hitler Youth. By now, however, Allied engineers had built a series of pontoon bridges on either side of the Ludendorff Bridge, prompting Kesselring to mount a series of increasingly suicidal missions to destroy each Allied crossing. He also called in fighter attacks and the world's first operational jet bombers, the Arado AR-234 Blitz, which flew 9 sorties over 6 days, yet failed to hit any bridges with each successive bombing run. In response, the U.S. First Army built up the greatest concentration of anti-aircraft guns ever witnessed in the war, shooting down more than 200 of the 367 aircraft sent in to attack the bridge works. In total desperation now, the Germans employed a 540mm mortar to knock down the bridges, missing 14 times before the mortar broke down, prompting Hitler to order strikes on the bridges with rockets, missing 11 times, yet managing to kill German civilians after several rockets hit a number of nearby German towns. Hitler then called in Otto Skorzeny, the legendary head of the SS Special Forces, who in turn dispatched 7 Waffen-SS frogmen to blow up the pontoon bridges. Employing canal defense lights that put out 13 million candle power of light, the Allies took out all 7 frogmen before they could reach their targets. 10 days after the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge, on the afternoon of March 17th, previous German demolition charges and the constant transit of heavy vehicles finally collapsed the bridge, killing 28 U.S. Army engineers who had been working on the bridge to make it safer. By the time of the collapse, the Allies had now inserted more than 25,000 men across the Rhine at Remagen, using their bridge network and a constant flow of ferries and landing craft, carving out a bridgehead 25 miles wide and 8 miles deep. 80 miles to the north of Remagen, Montgomery was preparing his own Rhine crossing at Ries and Wiesel. Monty's plan, codenamed Operation Plunder, and its airborne element Operation Varsity, would ultimately see more than 1.2 million Allied fighters cross the Rhine into the German heartland, requiring 60,000 tons of ammunition, 59,000 engineers, and 30,000 tons of engineering supplies, along with hundreds of landing craft and amphibious vehicles to ferry men in war machines across the river. To Monty's great irritation, however, a few hours before Plunder went live, he received word that his arch-rival, General George S. Patton, had beaten him across the Rhine. Not to be distracted by Patton's success or even a field visit by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, at dawn on March 23rd, 35,000 Allied guns began blasting away at German positions. 3 hours later, Operation Plunder went live when troops from the 51st Highland Division crossed the river aboard Buffalo amphibious armored transports. Pushing forward against demoralized defenses bereft of the necessary war supplies due to the destruction of German industry by Allied bombers, the 21st Army Group's crossing met little resistance, since most German soldiers at this point did not want to die when the end of the war was so clearly in sight. By 10 a.m., Monty was elated that the landings were going far better than war planners had originally expected, allowing Allied war leaders to commence Operation Varsity earlier than anticipated. But the next stage of his plan was the most risky, the massive airborne drop behind German lines, codenamed Operation Varsity. Varsity would prove to be one of the largest airborne operations of the war, consisting of nearly 4,000 transport planes and gliders, 900 fighters, and 16,847 paratroopers. As H-hour arrived at 10 a.m. on March 24th, Allied artillery fire went silent, and while German ground fire was at first light to non-existent, when the Germans realized what was happening, ground fire picked up substantially as approaching, slow-moving and low-flying Allied aircraft were unable to take evasive action during their drop runs. After the paratroopers came the gliders, which were slower, lower, and even more vulnerable on their approach, leading to nearly 100 Allied transport and glider aircraft to crash, including many C-46 transport planes whose vulnerable fuel tanks were punctured by enemy fire before leaking into the fuselage and turning crashing planes into fireballs of death, leading to more than 2,000 fatalities. Germany responded by sending in the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division into Ries for a counterattack, while the 116th Panzer Division was ordered to take back control of 3 Isel River crossings from Allied paratroopers. Instead, roving Allied fighters and bombers and Allied ground artillery decimated German troop buildups, which were shut down shortly after they began. Meanwhile, along the Rhine, Allied engineers continued to build pontoon bridges over the river, first for infantry traffic only, followed by more substantial bridges made of pontoons and steel segments for tanks and other heavy vehicles, fulfilling one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the war. The following day, Churchill met with Eisenhower in an optimistic assessment critique of the advance before Churchill crossed the Rhine for a 30-minute review of troop movements east of the Rhine. By March 26, the 21st Army Group now had 12 bridges in place over the Rhine, which saw Allied units moving deeper into German territory against a broken and nearly destroyed German army, who began to surrender in ever-increasing numbers. More crossings of the Rhine quickly followed, from Strasbourg to the Netherlands, many Allied units advancing more than 50 miles a day, passing through German towns and villages decked out in white linen flags meant to signify their unconditional surrender to Allied forces. As the Nazi Empire crumbled in disarray, Allied units quickly uncovered the horrifying crimes committed by the Nazi regime, in particular when Allied troops liberated concentration camps like Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, uncovering scenes of unimaginable suffering. Death was everywhere, and those still alive barely clung to life. In Auschwitz and other liberated camps, Allied cameras documented the gas chambers, where plaster walls showed the imprints of countless hands of the dying, who clawed hopelessly for a way to escape the gas. Cameras documented the crematoria, where the SS tried to eradicate the evidence of their crimes. Of the 60,000 prisoners liberated at Bergen-Belsen, British veterans recalled that the smell was appalling, forever altering each man's understanding of the Germans' own depravity. By the time Operations Plunder and Varsity had completed their missions on March 27th, the Western Allies had suffered some 6,781 casualties within their ground units, while airborne units suffered 2,700 more. The Germans lost an undocumented number of casualties, while an additional 19,500 men were taken prisoner. While Eisenhower and Montgomery agreed to let the Russians sweep into Berlin, during an afternoon situation conference on April 22nd, Hitler suffered a total nervous breakdown when he was informed that the orders he had issued the previous day for an all-out counteroffensive had not been obeyed, leading Hitler to confess for the first time that Germany's war of aggression had finally been lost. Hitler then announced that he would stay in Berlin until the bitter end, taking his own life before the Allies could capture him alive. Luftwaffe chief Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring learned about Hitler's suicide pact and sent a telegram to Hitler asking for permission to take over the leadership of the Reich in accordance with Hitler's 1941 decree naming him as his successor. Hitler's secretary Martin Bormann convinced Hitler that Göring was staging a coup, prompting Hitler to inform Göring that he would be executed immediately if he failed to surrender all of his posts. On April 28th, Hitler received a BBC report originating from Reuters, stating that Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler had offered Germany's surrender to the advancing Allied armies, which further threw Hitler into an inconsolable rage. He ordered Himmler's immediate arrest before executing Himmler's SS representative, Hermann Fegelein. During Fegelein's execution by firing squad, the Red Army breached Berlin's defenses as far as the Potsdamer Platz, and all indications were that they were prepared to storm the Chancellery. This report and Himmler's treachery prompted Hitler to make the final decisions of his life. Shortly after midnight on April 29th, he married longtime girlfriend Eva Braun in a small civil ceremony in the map room of his bunker. Hitler then hosted a modest wedding breakfast with his new wife before taking Secretary Traudl Junge to another room to dictate his last will and testament. The following day, Hitler appeared in a bunker corridor to offer his final farewell to about 20 assembled people, most of them women, shaking hands with each of them before retiring to his quarters for the final moments of his life. Hitler chose a pistol and poison method, which was suggested by his physician, while Eva Braun chose cyanide alone. Per Hitler's orders, both their bodies were dragged into a courtyard outside the bunker, doused in gasoline and set on fire. On May the 8th, after the Allies accepted Germany's unconditional surrender of its armed forces, Allied nations erupted in mass celebration as the war in Europe came to a close. More than 1 million people celebrated on city streets throughout Great Britain, while crowds amassed in London's Trafalgar Square and up the Mall to Buckingham Palace, where King George VI and Queen Elizabeth joined Churchill on a palace balcony, whipping the crowds into a triumphant high note. The future Queen Elizabeth II and her sister Princess Margaret were allowed to wander incognito among the amassing crowds, taking in the frenzy of celebration like average women on the street. Coinciding with Harry Truman's 61st birthday, the sitting American president dedicated the victory to the memory of his predecessor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had died less than a month earlier from a catastrophic cerebral hemorrhage. As American cities erupted in celebration, by the end of the day, Truman confessed that the victory made it his most memorable birthday to date. In France, after years of Nazi occupation, the liberated French took to the streets in orderly jubilation, fully aware that better days were finally here to stay. While most celebrants felt the elation of victory in Europe, both Churchill and Truman tempered their citizens with the weighing truth that war against Japan had not yet been won. In his radio address on VE Day, Churchill told the British people that we may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but Japan remains unsubdued. In America, Truman's May 8th birthday broadcast said that the fall of the Nazis was a victory only halfway won, making Operations Plunder and Varsity the last great battles of the Second World War.